most things in the world are just hype. Most things in the world are oversold and always underdeliver. But in my experience, sex, music, and psychedelics deliver every time. They are always actually better than advertised. The Holocene podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Alchemist Vision, delivering a new line of clothing, helping protect against the negative effects of EMFs. Check them out on Instagram at Alchemist Vision. For a 10% discount on your first order, at the checkout use promo code Holocene10 for a discount. Check them out online at www.alchemistvision.com.
Hello, this is Jay and Ben at the Holocene podcast, bringing you another episode. We wanted to do a bit of a dive on psilocybin, more specifically, recent mushroom trips that me and Ben have had, and just going into the whole link regarding science, depression, and exactly what these substances do to the mind to, I guess, open up further gateways. If you guys saw my recent video on a bad trip, marked The Belly of the Beast, then understand why this is quite a raw topic. But what we've also noticed is this whole concept is picking up a lot of steam. So we wanted to kind of go into that as well and discuss why we believe that's happening and the importance of these substances. So Ben, hello, how you doing?
Hi mate, yeah, I'm very well, thanks. It's an interesting topic that we've picked this time, and as you've already said, very relevant right now when you have a little look around what kind of content people are consuming. I know it's probably easy for me and you to suggest that it seems to be relevant and everywhere right now because we might have a little bit of bias towards what we're interested in and who we follow, for example. But when you see things pop up on platforms such as Netflix, and you see within this week, or I believe it was last week, the top 10 most viewed documentaries or programs on the platform, and you see one of them that's dominating the views is a documentary on exactly this topic, psychedelics, specifically magic mushrooms and LSD. I think it's pretty good confirmation that it is relevant right now. I mean, like I say, unless it's just confirmation bias on our part, I believe everybody has got some sort of interest in the concept of psychedelics.
Yeah, definitely. And it was actually that documentary that you mentioned, that you referred to on Netflix, that I sat down and watched it after talking to you, and it psyched me up for my recent turn of events. Prior to that, I had a couple of trips, but they were a little bit lighter. But after watching that, I thought, you know what, I'm going in. And as this podcast unfolds, there'll be more information in regards to exactly what played out there. But interestingly enough, I think it was when we started talking, this was about, it must have been a year, maybe a year and a half ago, that we actually started sharing each other's research, etc. And we really got talking around about the time that I think you did, or you readdressed psilocybin, and that's where you had your more planned experience. And around about that time is when I actually took DMT for the first time. So I think it was probably about a week in between, which was quite strange. I know, talking to you about your experience, and I was doing quite a lot of research on the obvious candidates, you know, the Terence McKennas of the world, and a friend of mine that I went to school with that I haven't seen in a very long time he actually posted on Snapchat that he had some DMT. So I messaged him and I was like, oh man, that's something that I've been looking into. And I started sort of quizzing him on it. And his reply was, look, you've messaged me for a reason and I think you should have a go. And I was, I actually put him off. I think I put him off probably 3 or 4 times that we were actually going to meet up because I was too scared. And this was actually, sorry, let me pull this back. This was before you had your experience, and I think you had yours. And then I finally thought, right, I'm biting the bullet. Let's get him round. Let's go for it. And that very experience, I think, changed my life and led us to where we are today, which we're going to talk all about, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting recap hearing you talk about that, because we can sort of plot and plan and potentially sort of have discussions on, oh well, how are we going to structure our conversation and all of these kind of ideas. But when it's finally come to this point where we're getting into the conversation and recording this podcast, it's much better to just I think it's much better that we just freely talk about this, because even myself, just listening to you reminisce there about our interaction on this particular subject, I even forget myself how long a process it's been just looking into such concepts. Incidentally, just as you were talking there about the possible fear aspect of delving into what is essentially an unknown sort of realm of mind health, if I can call it that. There's a quote by Joseph Campbell that came to mind, and I think it goes, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." And I've very often heard Will Smith talk about everything you ever want is on the other side of fear. Now, when you sort of relate that to psychedelics, at first hearing that, the average person might think, what the hell are you talking about? Like, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek, and you relating that quote or saying to psychedelics, the average person might think that you're talking crazy talk. But what I mean by making this point is, I think generally, and this is not just in the UK where we're positioned, it's a global sort of paradigm and dogma, if you like, of most people, that psychedelics are bad. They've been demonized, and I would attribute that aspect or that perspective on psychedelics to largely, I would imagine, the movement that rose up in the 60s from the uprising of LSD experimentation.
Yeah, that's something, again, in terms of my research, I guess that's kind of where you start, drawing back to the LSD movement and looking at Terence McKenna, looking at ayahuasca, people like Ram Dass, who was, unfortunately, he's passed recently. He was a huge ambassador to these psychedelics as well. And what I've actually come to realize, and this is the reason why I actually took the plunge, is it's directly linked to your spiritual growth. So the reason why people are afraid to take it is because when you take these substances, you have no choice but to face your inner demons. As Terence McKenna, as he put it, well, firstly on the DMT, he said that if there's any psychedelic drug stronger than DMT, I don't want to know about it, which coming from him is pretty, that's pretty big. But he references mushrooms as almost the mushrooms will pull up a chair on the porch and sit there and help you face your inner demons. And what I realized on my first DMT trip, I've done 3 now, I was completely out of the body. There was no me, like I didn't exist. So a lot of people call that ego death, which I'm still trying to comprehend exactly what that means, to be honest.
Mm.
The only thing that I can use as a reference is I didn't exist at the time. So there was no point of view from my perspective. It was everything in a weird roundabout way. But on my last mushroom trip, so again, I've done 3 of those as well. 2 were pretty playful. Things are funny. You're looking at the sky and you're looking at the beautiful colors, and you're very present. You're very in the moment, and it's a beautiful feeling, an experience that I think most people should try. But when I had the bad trip, ironically enough, it was actually really positive for about 2 hours. And then I just lost control. And I started to realize it was more on the come down, I'd suggest, that I was in a trip. And I was so sick of going in my mind. Like, I'm not afraid to face those demons, but when it's relentless for hours, you start getting a bit sick of it. And I thought, I need to end this. And when I was trying to end it, and I'm up in the kitchen, I'm trying to eat certain foods, and I'm trying to look at my phone, ways to come out of the trip. And I couldn't even look at, the phone was melting out my hand at this point. And I'm like, oh my God. And I actually ended up, and I didn't realize this was a thing. I probably should have done a little bit more research on this, but I ended up in what they call like a fear loop. And it just kept looping, and I just couldn't break out of it. And it took me about 30 hours to be able to process the difference between the trip and actual reality. It was horrendous. And after doing quite a bit of research after, I believe I understand why. But when you're in that, and it's easy to look at it in hindsight and go, oh, that's where I went wrong. But I think I know where that went wrong now. But when you're in the moment, you haven't got full control of the mind, and it's just running rampant, and it's looking at all the shadows in the deep crevices of your subconscious mind, and you're just completely lost. But on that point, what I've come to understand by looking at a lot of people who are, I'd suggest, experts in this field, there is no such thing as a bad trip, so to speak, because the bad trip is exactly what you needed at that specific time. And I look back now, and I said this to you at the beginning of, just before we started recording. This is quite hard for me to do this episode because it was a dark place. But equally, I'm looking back thinking, I think I needed that to help me push forward. So it's always a spiritual experience, and it's a lesson. It's not a drug like cocaine or heroin or, something like that, where you're doing it to party and to lose yourself. It's just almost throwing yourself into yourself, and you're wrestling with those demons that you've been so good at pushing down and hiding away from for so many years. And we don't, there's a reason why we hide from them, because they burn, and it's pretty brutal. So these psychedelic experiences they're pretty harsh. They're unforgiving. They really face you with you, and it always turns out to be exactly what the doctor ordered, as long as you're willing to take the jump, as we said.
That's interesting. Another person that me and yourself are heavily sort of influenced by, and we like to follow. We'll probably mention him, or I will probably mention him a million times going forward as we move with this podcast. But Paul Chek is a holistic wellness coach and therapist, and he often talks and references the hero's journey. Now, for people that are listening that are not familiar with that, I would encourage you to just do your own research and look that up as a concept, because what you were just describing, Jay, about the journey of life sort of thing, and the quest for knowing yourself and having the proverbial sort of look within, it's an interesting concept, and as you pointed out, he's quite daunting and scary at times. As I'm sure you're already aware, I'm one for a quote or a cliche, but another one that's coming to mind, just listening to you speak then, it was by Aldous Huxley, and it was quoted as saying, "If most of us remain ignorant of ourselves, it is because self-knowledge is painful and we prefer the pleasures of illusion."
Yeah,
Mm. Just
definitely.
incidentally, as you mentioned, another guy who's really good to look up when looking into concepts of understanding the self and the ego and psychedelics. You mentioned Ram Dass.
Yeah,
I haven't actually watched this documentary myself that I'm about to reference, but shout out Scott, aka Rayman, a friend of ours. He actually recommended a documentary featuring the story of Ram Dass. I believe it's entitled Going Home. If you want to
yeah.
check that out, I'll definitely be checking that out sooner rather than later.
Oh mate, I'm surprised you haven't listened to him. He's definitely up there. He's a little bit. He reminds me almost of like a hybrid between Terence McKenna and Alan Watts. So
Ooh,
he's got a full 360 like rounded spiritual understanding and view.
yeah,
So I recently listened to one of his audiobooks, which is a collection of his speeches and his lectures, called Becoming Nothing. I think it's called Becoming Nothing.
right.
Um, I actually listened to it when I was in Bali, and it just makes you think like we are just so connected to things that are out of our control, and the sooner you can, even if you still own it or you still experience it, just to know that you don't own it, and it is going to come to an end, and when it does, you let it go. It's such a
Mm,
profound thought. But back on the spiritual point, another experience I had, I actually, if you follow me on Twitter, and I spoke quite a lot about it at the time, but I went traveling in India last year, beginning of last year it was, and I went to a place called Rishikesh, and Rishikesh is one of the holy cities. It's where most of the yogis would reside, or they've been and they've taught, or they learned their meditation practice or Reiki or yoga from
mm,
Rishikesh. So it's quite a big place within the kind of spiritual movement. And I I went and I experienced that, and I've done a lot of like meditation and read a lot of books and listened to a lot of lectures and stuff on these topics. But I feel that with meditation, it's very good at making you realize that you are not necessarily your thoughts, and you shouldn't really give a lot of time to your thoughts, and especially a lot of worry. And you can observe a thought and you can let it go. You become quite good at understanding the difference between the me and the I. And you'd notice a thought or a feeling, and you ask yourself, like, why do I think that? Why am I worried about that? And it's quite good to look at things from a kind of bird's eye view and let them pass, and don't give them power to certain thoughts and worries and fears, etc. But I feel what that lacks is what the psychedelic experience gives you. So I think it's good to probably practice both, even though psychedelics you don't want to be going back too often, because it can be a bit harsh, as I stated. But it really kind of puts you face to face with these dark worries, as opposed to when you're doing the meditation and the spiritual practice. You're looking at them and you're kind of going, okay, and then you let them go. But the psychedelics is like bang, right in the face. Right, let's deal with this. So it's more hard hitting. It's hitting it head on. So I feel
yeah.
that personally, I think you should at least dabble with the psychedelics. And I know if you go further into the kind of Kundalini yoga practices, a
Mm,
lot of these, I would suggest, like professional practitioners, they know how to access the DMT molecule in the brain. And what I think, and I haven't experienced this, but I believe that they have a similar experience to what you would on the psychedelics. But obviously, theirs is from years and years of practice, where the psychedelics are accessible, and you could probably learn more in a 2 or 3 hour window than you would learn in a decade of spiritual practice.
yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up when you mention practices such as like Kundalini and yoga. Quick shout out to I Go Yoga Online. There'll be some future collaborations and information coming down the pipeline with them for future episodes. But yeah, yoga and Kundalini and the practice of, like, um, consciousness and understanding consciousness. I've actually, in the research leading up to recording this, I was looking into an organisation by the name of MAPS. It's an abbreviation, MAPS. And oh, sorry, for reference, if you look them up, MAPS, it stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they support clinical studies of psychedelics, MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, under safe environments. And there's a lot of really good forward-thinking doctors and professors behind that. Incidentally, the CEO is a guy by the name of Rick Doblin, and he's got a really interesting TED talk that you can find online. It's on YouTube, entitled "The Future of Psychedelic Assisted Psychotherapy." And one thing I noticed in that, he referenced a study relating to meditation and how that leads to reduced default mode network activity in the mind, in the brain, when compared to other sort of mind-related thinking tasks. I'll just read very briefly from the abstract on the study I'm referencing. It reads: meditation has been associated with relatively reduced activity in the default mode network of the brain, which is a brain network implicated in the modes of self-related thinking and mind wandering. And it goes on to sort of show findings that meditation, basically in a nutshell, has been shown to be enhancing for the calming of the mind and the understanding of your own self-image. But not to digress too much, while it's at the front of my mind, I was just gonna offer you, if it's of any comfort to you, when you said that this is a challenge for you to record such a conversation after your quote unquote bad trips.
The gateway to hell, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna offer my actual story about my first ever experience of psychedelics, because, as I'm sure the most of the listeners listening to this have probably never even heard of me, let alone know me in any way, shape, or form. But there's probably a number of listeners listening to it who know me or think they know me, and it might come as a surprise to them that I might have dabbled in such thing as psychedelics. But just going back to my point about offering you some comfort about my point is, you won't stay in that state of, oh, I had a bad one, maybe I should question whether I'm ever going to do any ever again. Because my first experience was many years ago when I went on a stag weekend for somebody, a friend that was getting married, and he had his stag weekend in Amsterdam. And I was young and reckless, and that was my first ever experience of taking psychedelic psilocybin via mushrooms. And experimenting with psychedelics, I will say this: if the setting and intention is not thought about prior to delving into such experiences, I wouldn't recommend anybody just does it willy-nilly, in the name of, let's just get off our faces, and we want to see some visuals and hallucinate and all of those things, because you don't know what you're messing with if you're doing it for those reasons. So, as you say, you had a bad one. I can confirm that when I did my first mushroom experience under those circumstances, where I was drinking, I'm not ashamed to say I was doing recreational drugs as well on that occasion, and I was not a person of the mindset I am today, where undertaking a psychedelic experience now is done with a lot of thought, a lot of research, and with good positive intentions to gain a better understanding of self. Um, but if
I could
anything,
imagine. I could imagine it being a shit show. Like even
oh,
when I did it, I went in it with intentions. I had a cool, calm setting in my house. Um, we had the right environment, but even then, I feel there was a tiny little bit of disrespect that I showed towards the mushrooms, and
right,
it found me. Don't get me wrong, it found me late. Like I said, 2 hours was brilliant. But also on that point, my intentions were quite dark. And what I mean by that is I wanted, like, it sounds weird, but I think about death all the time, probably every day. I always wonder what happens when you die. What's this all about? And these are like the main questions that I ask on a daily basis. So I went into it with the intentions of finding out. And I tell you what, I'd like to confirm that I found out, and it was dark. It was seriously dark. Again, we can go into this a little bit later, but it basically showed me exactly, like a mirror, what I wanted. And
mm,
if you're out partying and drinking and no real understanding of what you're getting into, it will show you
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well,
uh,
anyone that was witness to my experience, they'll probably be smiling if they're listening to this because I, I was, mate, in the middle of Amsterdam. Let's just draw a line under it. It was a bad trip.
yeah, I bet.
But my original point is, having said that, um, you could probably argue after that, and for many years it was my standpoint. I'm never doing that ever again. There's no need to do that. I had a bad time, a bad experience. Um, but that's not the case. Like I say, as you'll see, uh, if people watch that Netflix documentary that we referenced at the start, it goes by the name of Have a Good Trip for those that are interested. And it features many comedians, so-called celebrities, musicians, all giving their accounts and experiences of LSD and psilocybin experiences. But I would encourage people to go and watch that because it's sort of, I would describe it as a more light introduction to the world and realm of psychedelics, for somebody who's new to it. But it's such an interesting world when you get into it. Like you referenced earlier, your Terence McKenna's, your Alan Watts, and now all of these more recent sort of researchers. Another guy we haven't mentioned yet by name. I've actually bought his book recently. He goes by the name of Paul Stamets. He's a mycologist, which is obviously the study of mushrooms. Very interesting guy. I'd encourage people to look him up also, if you want to look into these things. But I was
Was he,
gonna
was he on the Joe
go
Rogan
on, go
podcast
on.
by any chance?
Yes, he was. I believe he's done a couple. I haven't listened to both. I've only listened to one.
The reason
But
I know that is he got me through the tail end of the bad trip. Ironically,
right,
I went to bed. This is about 9:30. The cut, it's fully. I'm sort of back to normal, but I was in fear, like real dark fear. And I put on Alan Watts, who is normally my go-to when it comes to, just getting clarity and just I don't know when I need to kind of have a bit of a laugh at my own worries and fears. Alan Watts is my go-to, so I put him on, and what I found was he was annoying me. I was getting angry.
really?
I was getting angry and upset, and it was really dark. So I actually put on one of those podcasts, and they were talking about bad trips. And funnily enough, I found quite a lot of comfort in hearing other examples of that and the reason as to why. And it doesn't last forever, and it's probably the best thing that will happen to you. And do you know what I mean? So it's almost like going into the darkness further actually gave me comfort, which is a was a really strange feeling. I thought a bit
Yeah,
of stand-up comedy or Alan Watts would bring me back to my senses, but no, it
yeah.
didn't. It didn't turn out to be that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating, mate. It really is. in the now, not to digress too much here, because I could easily take this off on another tangent, and before you know it, we'll stop talking about psychedelics, for example. But another name, obviously, we've been throwing loads out so far, but my more recent research and inquisitiveness towards psychedelics in recent years wasn't really born out of looking into some of the names we've already mentioned. It was kind of strange in a way, because the way I returned to looking into psychedelics was by watching a Joe Rogan podcast, as it happens, but it was with a man by the name of Graham Hancock, who I know that you're aware of. And he's a former journalist and writer. Well, he still is a writer. He's got many books that he's published. I'd recommend them to people if you want to look him up. And he very often, or predominantly, talks about ancient civilizations. Now, I know people might be thinking, well, what the hell has that got to do with it? But interestingly, within his research of the subject of ancient civilizations, he became very aware of another psychedelic plant-based experience by the name of ayahuasca, which a lot of listeners may have heard of that. I know me and you have spoke extensively about the possibility of doing an ayahuasca experience ourselves one day. But so Graham Hancock, looking into ayahuasca because it was relative to ancient civilizations, he's actually got a series that you can watch online on a platform called Gaia.com. That's GAIA.com. And it's really, I suppose you could describe it as a spiritual Netflix platform, really. And Graham Hancock's got a series on there, and it is simply called Psychedelica. So I would encourage people to look that up as well for an easy week-to-week episode-based education on the concept of psychedelics. It makes for some good research and some really good, honest information regarding the topic.
Yeah, definitely. I think he was my first proper exposure to the world of psychedelics, to be honest. He did a interview on Joe Rogan on the podcast where he was speaking about, he went down to, I think it was Peru. It might have been Brazil, actually. Either way, same, similar location and concept. But he was talking about he was addicted to smoking weed at the time. Really bad. Like every day it helped him to be creative with his writing and all of these things. And when he went, he had that experience that I was speaking about where it throws you basically back at yourself, and he faced what he calls Mother Ayahuasca, and it showed him basically everything he's done wrong, and it allowed him to feel the feelings of others in terms of the errors of his way as well. And I was just blown away when I listened to that. That was years ago, 6, maybe 7 years ago, I think, when I no, maybe a bit less, maybe 5 or 6, I don't know. But it was around about that time, and I had to kind of park it there because it was quite heavy. And like I said, the concept, it scared me. Like I don't really do any drugs. You know, when it comes to smoking weed or anything, that's once in a blue moon. The last time I did that was, ironically, was actually in Amsterdam at the end of last year, around November time. And even then, it just throws me in this dream state, and I can't comprehend, like, reality. Am I in reality? Am I not? One minute I feel fine, next minute I'm confused again. So my brain doesn't really do well on these type of drugs. So you can imagine the worry I had when I first got into these substances. And as I was saying to you earlier, because you said, and rightly, why would you do DMT, which is the strongest psychedelic? Why would you prefer that? And why would you do that first? It's crazy. But I know myself, and I know I can go into any difficult place for a short period of time, and I can face any trauma. It's when it drags on, that's what I'm scared of. And my worry of mushrooms was, If it lasts 3, 4, 5 hours, that is a long old time, especially when you lose the concept of time, which is the first thing to go, by the way. It's the first thing to go.
Mate, I'm glad you said that, because I was just thinking it as you were talking. I was thinking, yeah, you definitely lose all track of time when you're under these experiences.
It's immediate. It's so immediate that it leads you to question, does it even exist?
Yeah.
Like, what even is? I mean,
what is time?
Yeah, I mean, like, our experience of time is probably the most fickle thing that we experience. It's so easily manipulated. And a good example is go kick a ball around with your mates playing football for an hour. Feels like 15 minutes. But
Do you
then
know something, mate?
go and do a plank for 2 minutes. It feels like an hour.
Yeah.
It's so easily distorted. And on DMT, there is no time. There is no body. You know, all of these things are gone. Again, time's the first thing. But because it's a shorter period, you're in, you experience it, and then you come back, and then you feel fine. But what I found after mushrooms is it lasted at least a day. My brain was just firing. I've never experienced anything like it. It's like, you know, and we looked into it. We were sharing a couple of studies actually before the podcast where we're talking about how it enhances your neuro links within the brain. And there's a picture which I'll put up when we do the final edit of this video, where it basically shows you when you're not on mushrooms, and then image of your brain when you are. You're talking like 3 times the amount of activity. It's insane. And that doesn't just shut off when you come down. That, like I said, I went to bed at about 9:30, absolutely shattered. I didn't fall asleep till 2 a.m. My brain was just like, you know, it's crazy. But what I found with DMT is it puts you back where just as you begun. The only thing is you got more questions, but you're just back in the room and you're normal. You know, you can drive your car, you can cook your dinner, whatever.
Well, that's an interesting concept for me, because and going back to what you said not too long ago about how we were discussing when I said to you, like, I can't believe that in this sort of concept of experimenting with psychedelic experiences, that you went straight off the deep end. Like, you know, you put your big boy pants on and you went straight in for DMT. Like, to me, I personally haven't ever had a DMT experience yet. I've always sort of held the belief that I suppose this is a generic ideal that society has. Weed is a gateway drug, and then you sort of then possibly, I would suggest you then progress to mushrooms, and then maybe LSD, and then as you progress, eventually you end up doing something like an ibogaine or an ayahuasca or a toad experience, which fundamentally is dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the compound that's within those plant-based experiences. But yeah, crazy and interesting all the same that you went straight in and went for DMT. I just find that amazing.
I think it's because I know myself, and I'm in and out. Like you said, a 1 minute. What was it you said?
A 1 minute man.
I'm in, I'm out. It's like when I go to the gym. Like, my friends will say, "How do you go so consistently?" It's because I don't go and have a social. I have my headphones in. It's like my hour where no one speaks to me. I'm just in the zone, which I miss, by the way. I miss it so much. I'm not even going to lie. And obviously, if anyone listens to this in the future, we're at the tail end of the lockdown. So we're talking 9 weeks or 10 weeks now. But I put my headphones in, I do everything I need to do quick, you know, in and out, see you later. I see some people, they're on the bench and they're lifting and they'll sit there for 4 minutes texting and having a chat. I'm like, I ain't got time for this. I'll suffer quickly. Like, if I'm going to suffer, make it quick. uh, and I tell you what, DMT did exactly that, and it did that so well that I went back another 2 times, and that was in
Mm,
relatively quick succession as well.
yeah.
Whereas mushrooms, it dragged on so long. I honestly can't see myself doing it for a long period of time. And as I said to you earlier again on the phone, if I do it again, I need a sitter. I need someone that I can turn around to and they can remind me that I've done this before and that it's all going to end.
Yeah.
Because I even called you after and I was like, I feel like it's never going to end.
Yeah.
And just to
Um,
put that into context, I took these at about 4 p.m. and I called you at about 9 p.m.
yeah.
Just 5 long, grueling hours where you don't have
Yeah,
the
man.
concept of time. And I was like, Ben, when do I go back to normal, man? It was just unbearable. And I think I've got a relatively strong mind.
Yeah.
I
Well,
do,
I would agree with that. I would agree with that definitely.
but I lost
I,
it, mate. I lost it.
yeah, I mean, I don't mean to laugh and be so entertained by it, but obviously because I was privy to that phone call, for example, as you're talking about it, I can't help but smile broadly and chuckle about it because I can relate to it so much. My more recent experiences, backed by more research and knowledge before I had the experimental trips with mushrooms, for example, they were similar in terms of when you're out of the let's call it the meat of the experience and you're coming out the back end, you do feel that urge of you've got lots of questions and a lot of confusion and you I would argue you're searching for a little bit of clarity, a little bit of comfort, and the concept of just calling your friend. I've been there, I've done it. My friend who I've sort of dabbled in these experiences with, um, we've both done the same thing, called each other up. The reason it makes me chuckle that you called me not too long. I mean, I would suggest that from memory, listening to you talk, I remember it so well. You were still tripping. Like I know that because, like I say, I've experienced it receiving a phone call from a friend who had not long come out of an experience himself, and you just know when someone is tripping because to a sober person, if I can call it that, you sound like you're talking absolute bollocks, but
Mate,
it
the worst
makes
thing is,
sense.
I, I had I had you in my ear. I had my earphones in, and when I was talking, firstly, it didn't feel like the noise was coming from my face, but you in my ear felt like you was in my soul as
I
you were
was in your
talking.
head, mate.
Oh, I was just like, what is going on? And like I said, I've had these experiences before, but this was mega.
Yeah,
Uh, but it'd be good to talk about the difference, I think, between the DMT and the mushrooms. I
yeah,
just wanted to make a couple of points on what I found.
yeah.
So with the DMT, so when you take it, and you need to be aiming for 3 hits. That's like the goal.
Hmm.
So you're on the second, and you're at the point where you're like, okay, I'm going already. This is major. Whereas mushrooms can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. When I did
Right.
lighter doses, 20 minutes, this heavy one, 25, 30 minutes in, I'm like, it hasn't even done anything. An hour in, it started kicking my ass, right? But
Mm.
this DMT, it got to the point where I'm looking around the room, everything looks like mushroom land, which you'll know if you've done it. You know, you're looking at the door, it looks like a cartoon. You look round, I was looking at my sofa and it looked like it was melting and coming towards me, which was a weird experience. But then there's no time to be scared because before you know it, you're shot into outer space and you're in this world where fear doesn't exist because I don't exist and fear only exists within me,
Mm.
right? Whereas when I was on the tail end of the mushroom trip, I'm back in the room and I'm back in myself. So fear exists because I'm myself experiencing the experience. But when I
Mm.
did the DMT, there is no time for that. And also, when you go, you hear this noise. the whole time, by the way. It's like you hear that the whole time. So even when you're in the trip, you can still hear it in the background, which is
Yeah.
like, what the hell is this? Whereas like a good example, when I was in the peak of the mushroom trip, I was listening to music. We had some music in the background, and it was this guy playing this really nice guitar tune. And as I'm going on this journey, the music was guiding me. So it's like I was
Mm,
going with the music. Whereas with
mm.
DMT, there's like, wong. So you're completely gone. So I feel like you're more on the mushroom trip. You're more subject to your surroundings and the vibes, the feng shui, whatever, the energy, the person you're with, that guides you. Whereas with the
Yeah,
DMT, there's none of that. It's you could do it driving down the motorway and you'll be out of body. It just
yeah,
it just ruins you. And I said earlier, like you could have slapped me in the face as hard as you wanted, and I wouldn't have even noticed. So it's
yeah.
just, you're just in a different world. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I think that is a nice tie-in to go back to something that is referenced in these documentaries that we encourage people to watch, where they make the point that setting and intention are vitally important when you're going to go into these experiences. To quote Terence McKenna again, considering you just referenced you listen to some music, for example, and one of my favorite cliches, ideas, quotes is music is life. That's why our hearts have beats. And Terence McKenna, on the topic of psychedelics, he was quoted as saying, most things in the world are just hype. Most things in the world are oversold and always underdeliver. But in my experience, sex, music, and psychedelics deliver every time. They are always actually better than advertised.
did
So
you
yeah,
post this on Instagram yesterday?
possibly I post a lot to Instagram.
Because funny you say that. I read that exact quote yesterday, and I don't know if it was
Really?
you or if I read it somewhere else. Yeah, literally last night, and I thought that is bang on.
Yeah, it's possibly it might have been me. So I mean, mate, we've been rambling for nearly an hour of just our own experiences and thoughts. Maybe we should now sort of look at some of the science that we've discovered behind all of this. Do you want to pull up, because we've got quite a lot of real good evidence and research that we've found between us. Do you want to touch on maybe a study or an article that we found relating to what psychedelics do to the brain function and activities?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Actually, just coming off your last point, and I guess linking to what you've just suggested, I think the reason why that happens, not so much with DMT, because I think it fires you into fully immersed in this other realm. Whereas I
Mm,
feel the other psychedelics, you still have some tiny attachment to your surroundings. And I feel that
mm,
your subconscious mind is fully in control at this point. And the reason why your surroundings are so important is because your subconscious mind it doesn't miss a thing. This is why TV programs are TV programming. It's to do with it
mm,
lowers your brain frequency. I think it's to theta or delta, and
yeah.
your conscious mind is almost half asleep. It's almost like asleep at the wheel while the information is going straight into the subconscious mind. So when you do these psychedelics, it's that, but basically on steroids. So whatever's around you or whatever's floating around in the subconscious mind is basically taking full control. Just like when you dream. This is why when you dream, it's always linked with symbolism. You know,
Hmm.
Funnily enough, and I think I may have spoke about this before, I had a dream recently about a cockroach and killing a cockroach. So I've
Hmm.
woken up and I've read into it, And what I was reading was pretty much what's happening in my life at that exact moment. So what's happened is the subconscious mind, which deals with symbolism, and this is why symbolism is probably the most spoke language on the planet, especially within the subconscious, it runs absolutely riot. So it's all to do with that big connection. So what we know when we do psychedelics, and like I said, it opens up these neuro pathways. And I actually listened to something recently, and I can't remember who it was, but they were saying it's like, for instance, if you look at like a snow slope where multiple times someone's gone down there on a snowboard and it's started to create grooves. What the psychedelics do is it basically flattens out the grooves. So the grooves will be, for instance, could be depression, it could be habits, good or bad habits, it could be certain thought habits as well. And what it does is it almost levels everything out, and it can actually undo the grooves that you've created over years or certain thinking habits, where it can to some degree create a new process of thought and almost a blank page when it comes to things like I just said, bad habits, or even as far as mental health as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. I was just, as you were speaking there, I was just looking at some of the articles and the studies that we found, and as you ended your point on mental health, we'll get to that in a minute. But one of the articles that you shared with me when we were collating some of this evidence was an article about how psychedelic drugs rebuild brains. I thought that was fascinating when you sent it through, and the relation to the treatments of mental illnesses and depressions, for example. There's quite extensive studies being done on treating people not only with addiction, but depression and anxiety, for example. If just bear with me while I pull the study up that I was looking to find. But I wanted to make a point of the dogmas behind the demonization of psychedelics. We spoke, building up to this, about Dave Chappelle, the comedian, and how in some of his skits he references the movement of LSD and psychedelics from the 60s, and that they were probably, well, it's well documented now. If you can search it out on the internet, that they were government programs by the CIA, where they deliberately started, unbeknown to the public population that they were testing it on, they were actually deploying psychedelic programs without public knowledge on society. The conspiracy theory behind it is that would suggest and promote mind control. But as Dave Chappelle in his stand-up comedy makes the point, he said they shut all that shit down because they realized it was mind expanding. And I really feel that we're living in a period now where there's chronic fatigue, there's chronic rates of depression and anxiety, and conventional medicine and treatments, as great as medical advancement is, and some of the treatments are unbelievably advanced nowadays. The fact that something like psychedelics, which countless studies now, as we're about to start looking at, suggest that they should be used for good, the fact that they are still demonized and still illegal in most countries is just, it's incredibly insane in my opinion.
Not only illegal, we're talking class A, lifetime in prison. It's just madness. but it had its negatives. Like, it was linked into the Charles Manson murders, and a lot of that was to do with mind control with LSD in the 60s as well.
Yeah.
But on that point, do you listen to Bill Hicks, or have you followed Bill
I
Hicks?
have. After you've recommended him in the past year or so, I've seen quite a number of his videos up on YouTube. He's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Because he touched on this, and I think towards the end, I think he had a few breakthroughs as well. And one of the quotes that he did, so he was talking about how the police or the mainstream media always talk about how someone took LSD and ended up jumping off a building and they thought they could fly and whatever. And he said they'll never tell, like, they never cover this, or you've never heard them say this. And what he said is, today a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, but we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imaginations of ourselves. I remember when I first heard that, I was about 16 years old, and it struck a chord. And this was way beyond, like, before I knew anything, and I was totally asleep and whatever. But you can learn that. I think the problem we have is, especially like in today, and I don't want to try and get too political, but when you look at the left, that's something that they don't know, that information. And I feel like if you know that, you start looking at the world differently, very differently, right? And I feel that you can come to that conclusion through many different things. And that's what I kind of linked to at the beginning of the podcast. Spiritual practice, even like looking at conspiracy stuff, I feel that that's the thing that's covered up. So when you look at the conspiracy theorists, I don't think, I mean, and I've said this before, don't get me wrong, there are real conspiracy theorists. I'm not denying that. But I feel like that's the underlying theme, and that's what they're trying to tell you through other means. But once you start looking into a lot of these guys, like, for instance, David Icke, that is his message. Literally, that is his message. And then when you do psychedelics, it slaps you in the face with that message. It's like the first thing that you know. So when people are telling me, like, they're atheists and there's no proof of God and all of these things, and I think that they're caught up on the words. I feel like if they took any type of psychedelic, and I'm not saying it will change their views completely, but they won't disregard that very point, because you realize that very early on.
Yeah, I watched another documentary today before we entered this discussion, and it goes by the name of Dosed, D-O-S-E-D, and while it predominantly follows a heroin addict's journey into the use of controlled treatment, firstly with psilocybin magic mushrooms, and then she progresses to ibogaine treatments. The concept of safe treatment, I think, it's relatively unknown amongst people, because again, I touch on the point of how the whole psychedelic idea and experience is completely demonized. Incidentally, when, as you were mentioning, like class A's and things like that, more recent times in the UK, our Conservative government produced a new piece of legislation, which is the Psychoactive Substances Act. I think it was updated or brought in 2016, if I'm correct. And basically, it's a piece of legislation that renders it unlawful to trade in any substance capable of producing psychoactive effects of any kind, regardless of harm or benefit. And if you read the text of the act, it is absolutely extraordinary, like, because most notably, it just has a lack of any reference to the concept of harm. It's just crazy. Like, as far as a piece of legislation, I mean, I'm no expert in legislation and law and all these things, but just my basic understanding of it. It's insane. There was a study carried out in 2010 by a team which was led by a man called David Nutt, and it measured the various substances in terms of harm to society and individuals. And what the study showed was that of all the substances, alcohol is the overall front runner in terms of harm. And then secondly, right next to it is tobacco. And a lot of the class A drugs, which I believe in the US, it's determined Schedule 1 drugs, and psychedelic drugs, for example, were at the opposite end of the scale, and they actually show very low risk of harm. So, and yet alcohol and tobacco, well, we all know the be all and end all of those, like they're just harmful to everybody.
It suits I guess the way that we are within society, which is always go, 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 think.
Yeah.
And not even like go in the subconscious and think, and like we said, express yourself at a higher level or understand yourself from a deeper perspective. It's surface thinking. This is why coffee is the second most consumed drink on the planet. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a coffee, but it's almost closing your mind and keeping you kind of one-dimensional and, bang, 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 bang. And I feel alcohol does the same to most people. I had this conversation with you before, and the reason why I like a drink, and when I say I like a drink, I'm talking once, maybe twice a week, is because it's the only time where I stop research and I can actually look at myself in a way, and I guess kind of take a step back and think, do you know what, Jay, you're doing all right. Do you know what? Life ain't bad. We got a nice house. We're doing well. Like, I'm settled down. I'm happy. I'm working on my business. And when I have a drink, I just take a step back and I can really appreciate those things, and it allows my mind to rest slightly. So for me, I feel drink is it works for me in some respect, whereas it doesn't work for a lot of people, and especially when you're using it excessively. Whereas if I, for instance, look back when I was 18, every time I had a drink, there was a fight. Either I attracted it to me, or I was the initiator of the situation. I couldn't help it. I was just angry. Deep down, I was angry. Whereas now I look at it as more take a chill pill, relax, because I'm quite uptight when I'm normal. My normal waking life is relatively uptight. Again, coffee, stimulus, research, work, exercise, everything's like go all the time. That's why people like me need to meditate. So but when you look at things like marijuana or mushrooms and things like this, they literally put you on your ass and you've just got to sit there and ride it. And that doesn't serve society, because it won't take long, in my opinion, from doing psychedelics or even smoking weed, if you're not doing it every day. Like, if you're doing it once every couple of weeks and you go pretty hard and you really, really start looking at the world through these eyes, it doesn't take long before you start realizing this doesn't make sense. And a great example is racism. That's like the best example for me. You think, what the fuck is racism? Like, don't get me wrong, I understand that it exists. Like, it's easy for a white man to say, racism doesn't exist. I understand, especially at the core of certain societies. Like, we know in America, like, the way it's sort of set up in some regard is it's definitely against certain, minorities. Let's not even play stupid. It's 100%. But when you're doing these type of drugs, or you're doing any kind of spiritual practice, it doesn't take long before you realize, what the hell are we doing? We're all human beings. Like, it's ridiculous. And then you start questioning you question your job. I live in a house that costs me loads of money. I've then got to go to work when I don't get to enjoy my house because I'm at work all the time. And then I'm earning money, which I'm just paying for my house, and I'm paying loads of money for a car, which takes me to the job which is the vehicle that basically takes me away from the house that I'm spending hours and hours a week working to pay for. And you
Yeah.
start asking these questions where drinking coffee and drinking beer, drinking beer all the time and socializing down the pub with your mates, that's not really on the sort of top end of the spectrum of conversations. You're talking about fighting or football or a load of old rubbish.
Distractions.
Exactly. Stimulated and distracted. That
Yeah.
is why the war on drugs is nothing more than that. That's why, and we know things like cocaine are illegal, but bloody hell, it ain't hard to get hold of some. It is not hard.
Well, yeah, it's everywhere. It's infiltrating society. In terms of problematic drug crisis in the world, that documentary I referenced, Ghost, that I watched earlier, that followed that heroin addict. It starts on the documentary with a statistic or some statistics and quotes from, ironically, the World Health Organization, and it stated 1.6 billion people today suffer with anxiety, depression, and or addiction. And last year, the opioid and fentanyl crisis in the US claimed 118,000 lives. So there's a fundamental problem there with the way we are approaching anxiety, depression, and addiction, because
but we're missing the point. We're missing the point. The same people that are causing that state of affairs are the people that we're looking at for the answers.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like if you look at mental health, if you go to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they're starting with real basic shit, but it's so simple. So they've only just started to realize that meditation is important. It's like, what? Funding in mental health areas in the UK is beyond laughable. We're probably putting more money in fracking than we are in bloody mental health, even though it's probably the biggest killer in the country if you sort of boil down to it.
Yeah. Well, it's the paradox, which is painfully obvious that everyone would find it hard to disagree with, is when you consider that medicine and pharmaceutical drugs and therapy I think it's somewhat like the US alone. I think they spend over $3 trillion a year in the space. Like, and what do we actually achieve out of it? Do you know what I mean? And I know this is sort of digressing into other topics, but the whole pharmaceutical industry and approach to medicine, it needs huge overhaul and readdressing, because it's nothing more than a lobbyist organization that's fit for profits and not purpose.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like we give too much power to this system as well.
Right.
Like I was talking to someone about, this was early doors in the COVID situation, and they were like, I'm dosing my kids up with loads of fruit to get the vitamin C. And I was like, that's not the best way to get vitamin C, man. Like if you look at, it's all to do with certain vitamins that you take with others, which basically increase the absorption of the minerals and the vitamins. So if you're banging in loads of sugar, you're not going to be digesting that vitamin C as well as if you were taking some straight non-synthetic vitamin C substitutes, as well as, say, for instance, calcium is a good example, right? Yeah. And they was talking, I was saying like vitamin D. I said since day one, vitamin D is key here. Vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, these factors. And he was like, why would I trust you? You're not a doctor. And I'm like, why would you trust a doctor for nutritional advice? And he's like, because they studied. Well, he goes, because they studied it at university. I was like, mate, they studied it for about 4 hours in their whole 4 to 7 years, right? And I sent him I sent him an American breakdown, basically, of the hours invested in each study when getting a degree in medicine. And his response was, that's America. I was like, what? I was like, mate, I'm going to be honest with you. I've done more research on nutrition this week than a doctor's done in his whole bloody degree. Like, don't get confused.
Academic education, yeah. It's
Yeah,
textbook
so,
education.
well, what happened is medicine, and this is why we're so why we're so good with acute problems, because what we do, and we do it bloody well, like, let's not even try and dispute that. We are incredible at dealing with symptoms. So when you have an
Mm,
acute problem, the acute problem is an acute symptom. And we're amazing. You go in, you have, I don't know, a chronic backache. You go, you take your tablet, it's fine. And as what we don't realize is the body's actually healing itself. And then before you know it, you're back to some type of normality. But we
yeah,
don't look at the cause of anything. When you
yeah.
look at mental health, and I've had my fair share of issues over my time. If anyone who's listening to this watched my interview on XRP Army on their YouTube, I was talking about when I was 20, my best friend died, and he
Hmm.
died out of nowhere. By the way, it was horrendous. And I'm 20 years old, my best mate in the world, and I'm like, what the hell? And I struggled pretty badly with mental health during that period. And
Yeah.
what I come to realize is the basic things that we were talking about is controlling the mind. It's meditation. I actually ended up on antidepressants, and I was talking to a friend of mine at the time because they were bad. Like, they ripped me in half. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't get to sleep at night. Even if I did, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, wide awake, and that'd be me for the day. I was throwing up every morning, and like someone said to me who takes them regularly, they said it gets worse before it gets better. And I was thinking that I'm not having that. Something's wrong there. And I spoke to a friend and his mum, again, we were 20 years old. His mum was taking antidepressants for about 10 years. And he said when she got on them, she couldn't get off them, and she's been on them ever since. So at that moment, I stopped immediately. I probably took them for 2 weeks. I was being sick every day. I felt horrendous. And I was like, is this the best thing that we have to deal with mental health problems? And when I went into the doctors to talk about it, I signed a form, and it was about 9 tick boxes. And then I've walked away with these heavy tablets, diazepam, or
Mm,
something. I can't remember what they were called. And it was awful. And I just think that people that haven't had these experiences that we're talking about, people that don't have access to, the literature, the scientific literature, or any kind of spiritual practice, or reading certain books, like, for instance, Alan Watts or Osho or Sadhguru, or, these individuals, or even as far
mm,
as Joe Rogan, he approaches this pretty well, and he's
yeah.
quite thorough in this stuff. Without that, and if you look at the medical industry as the only option, honestly, wow.
Yeah.
And I often say, and I'll just leave it here because I'm at risk of rambling on again. I often say, in regards to people waking up, so you have the people that they blindly trust the establishment, and then you have the other,
Mm,
and the other people can go in great layers of depth. Some people, they just have an inkling that something isn't right. Other people are full blown esoteric research, looking into all of, whatever. And so people will only be subject to the system as long as it hasn't failed you. As,
right.
as soon as the system fails you, and the medical institution or whatever the system is doesn't have an answer for you, that's when you go down the alternative route. And once you start, it doesn't take long before you start realizing that there's answers to everything, but the answers aren't given to you by the people that you look at for the answers. That
Mm,
that makes sense.
yeah, totally.
And that could,
I'm glad.
oh, I was going to say that could be anything from mental health, as we said. That could even be diet. That could be dentistry. You go to
Yeah.
the dentist and they give you like a butcher, a bloody butchering your teeth apart. And then you start reading someone like Weston A. Price, and you realise this is to do with diet, man. This isn't bloody
Yeah.
sugar and fluoride. Like, wow. And it doesn't take long, is what I'm sort of trying to go at. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's a slippery slope from there, man. And the establishment fails people on a daily basis.
Yeah. They're consistent with that, if nothing else. But I'm glad you brought up and touched quite extensively on the concept of vitamins and minerals and diet, for example, and linking it to mental health and depression. I'm going to get to a study in a minute, but to steal some knowledge from Paul Chek again, the holistic practitioner that I referenced earlier. When you listen to some of his basic teachings and he talks about diet and the body and the way it functions, he when he talks on the topic that we're pumping out at an alarming rate, billions of dollars worth of psychoactive drugs and therapies for brain and psychology related problems, he asks the question that has any of these people ever been assessed for their water consumption and their hydration levels? Because I can't recall the book that he references, but we'll try and figure it out for the slides on the video. But there's a book on the importance of water and hydration, and I know that you and I are quite knowledgeable on this in terms of the correct water that we should be consuming. But research shows that when the central nervous system is as little as 1% dehydrated, it has significant psychological effect on the brain and mind. If particularly the frontal cortex, if I'm correct in saying, that affects your mood, your attention, your memory, and your motor coordination. So, linking it back to your point about vitamin C and vitamin D, for example, all the vitamins and minerals that we consume from diet, they're not totally redundant, but it makes it very hard for us to assimilate them from a biological standpoint if our hydration isn't even on point.
One of the biggest things that I focus on and have focused on for a long time. But if you don't have your water right, and I'm talking all you need is probably 2 liters a day of clean water, then you're a ticking time bomb, man. You're the toxicity, because when you look at things like distilled water, and again we'll do another video on this, because me and you, I think it's fair to say we know quite a lot about this over the years. And I've been distilling water for easily a year now, probably even longer, to be honest. And I've noticed a huge difference in terms of eliminating toxicity. It's incredible. If you don't drink enough, even water, you're not going to be getting rid of anything. And if you're if you're not drinking enough, you go one further, you're not drinking enough of pure water, you're definitely not going to be eliminating anything. And then you look at when you're drinking pure water, it's incredibly important. But that's just another thing that they've demonized as well, is pure water.
I mean,
they've put us against the sun. They've turned us against the sun. They've turned us against nature. They've turned us against real food, and they've turned us even against pure water. That's how well they are, how good they are in terms of the mind control techniques. Where people tell me, you're drinking distilled water, that's so dangerous. I'm like, mate, you're drinking a can of Coke. Like, what are you doing?
and I mean, this is, we're not saying that we're perfect and we've got our health in check. We've all got hang-ups and we've all got ill disciplines. Like, I'm addicted to sugar, and I love a bit of chocolate. I love a cake. And
mate, I've told you, you do that carnivore diet, and that will go. Telling you, those cravings, they're gone.
Yeah, well, one step at a time, mate. I do have strong intentions to really put myself to the test and go full on. And I'm sure as you've experienced, the carnivore diet is for another episode. So not to digress too much away.
We've got so many episodes.
I know, right?
Out, as we talk, obviously we started on psychedelics, but as we're going on, there's about 5 that I think without even researching, I think we could have interesting conversations about.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to bring it back to the study I was talking about, when I was looking up some of this and looking for some of the current clinical trials and doctors leading the way in terms of depression and anxiety, for example, at the Imperial College London, there's a doctor, female doctor by the name of Rosalind Watts, and along with David Nutt of Imperial College London, they published an article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and it's a study relating to patients' accounts who took part in these clinical trials of increased connectedness and acceptance after psilocybin treatment under the premise of resistant depression. And extending from that as well, there is a doctor, I believe, from New York by the name of Stephen Ross, and he covered a psychedelic research program with cancer patients to reduce anxiety brought on by their terminal illness by treating them with psilocybin. So these are pretty comprehensive and very interesting peer-reviewed studies that are being undertaken. It's very fascinating some of the work that Dr. Rosalind Watts is doing at Imperial College London. I would encourage people to do their own research and look her up because, I mean, you know, as I said earlier, referencing the World Health Organization statistic, 1.6 billion people suffer from anxiety and depression. So you know, there's help out there. There's alternate things we can do and look to better our health and specifically our mental health at that. But yeah, we've got so much information to share with everyone. I'm almost bursting at the seams with anticipation with where we're going to take this podcast. Incidentally, sorry to keep rambling on, but another peer-reviewed study that I found, which is very relative to what you were referencing with diet. This study is entitled Mushrooms, a potential natural source of anti-inflammatory compounds for medical applications. I mean, if if it's proven and there's peer-reviewed studies out there that suggest mushrooms have anti-inflammatory benefits, that is groundbreaking, and the more studies done in that area, the better, because inflammation, when linked to dis-ease, is incredibly important. And again, another reason why you need to get your water consumption on point, because inflammation is it's a real killer.
Yeah, and I think what we've spent a lot of time on this podcast is what it does for your mental health. So obviously, if you are struggling and you have depression or anxiety, then it will, of course, help. We know that. But I think another aspect that we haven't really focused on is what it will do to your paradigm if, say, for instance, even if you don't have mental health issues. So, like we said,
Yeah.
just almost lifting the veil of reality.
Hmm.
And I'd like to put that to you just to kind of see what your views are on that subject and what it did to yourself when you, not, let's forget the first time, because obviously that was a bit of a horror show, but what do you think it will do to those who, for instance, live 100% in the material world and believe that maybe this is all there is, and you know, you don't have a say in your life. It's literally, you're born within a family, you have a specific life that may be planned, may not, maybe a complete freak accident or whatnot, and then you die. Like, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on that topic, and I guess because I've been quite negative on this experience, but that's only because I recently had quite a negative experience. If we'd done this podcast 2 weeks ago, it would have been a completely different conversation from my part, at least. So I'd like to hear your view on that. I think in terms of further science, if I'm honest, if we keep delving in, and we do have quite a lot more, but I think the points have been made. We know it's, the dopamine levels and the serotonin levels and the, your neurons are firing up in the brain, and it can sort of change things in terms of your perception and a kind of, a hallucination type scenario. But ultimately, what does it do from the person that is taking the psychedelics in terms of their belief of the world that's around them?
From my personal experience with psilocybin, for example, the first time in recent times, I'm not including my crazy first experience in Amsterdam. I sort of disregard that in this context, but
We'll forget about that one.
yeah, I started with, and I would encourage, I mean, I'm no expert and arguably not one to be giving out people dosage advice, but if you, I was just trying to find it actually, like an imagery of a psilocybin dosage chart, because I did see one on one of the documentaries or one of the posts you shared with me. I can't find it right this second, but it goes something like visual, mind opening, heroic, and something else. I might have butchered that, but I started off with a microdose experience, because
By the way, I don't think you had a microdose. By the way, in terms
my
of your
first one.
yeah, because you were like, I did a couple of grams.
Well, yeah, I should.
Because microdose is misleading. So
Yeah,
I was
it's
doing
less
quite a
than
bit.
half a gram. It's less than half a gram to microdose. Yeah, I will say, okay, in that case then I had more than a microdose, more so a more milder and mellow.
Because you don't want
First,
people going, I'm going to bosh a gram and a half because it's a
yeah,
microdose. And then what happens? What happened to me happens to them.
yeah. Well, on that point, we should like make it clear we're not recommending that this is for everybody. Like we're just sharing our ideas and experiences. But that's sort of where I started. Let's say, for argument's sake, it was around about 2 grams. Now, I did see a lot of mild visuals by the forms of geometric patterns, lots of lights and colors, fractals, and it was very serene, very peaceful, very enjoyable. But I wouldn't suggest that I was out there in terms of I was out of body and I wasn't in touch with quote unquote reality, because I was still interacting with people that were sharing the experience with me. I was still able to get up and dance and walk around and
Did you go
just
in?
do.
Did you go in at this point? And you know
Um,
what I mean by in, like as soon as you're sat still and looking at something, or you close your eyes, it
yeah,
sucks you in. Did you have
yeah,
that at this point?
not on my first time that I've just been describing. On the
Yeah.
second
It's more
experience,
playful and music sounds
yeah,
great. Colors are beautiful.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. But although it's very difficult for myself, and I would argue anybody, to really articulate a mushroom experience coherently to somebody that's listening to your account, I will say this: I came out of that experience, and I distinctively remember during it, I kept saying and having the consistent thought process of like, for example, this is word for word what I kept saying, and I kept repeating, I get it now, I get it, I just get it, I get it. And I don't really know why I was saying it, but post trip coming out of that experience, like I say, it was very serene, it was very peaceful. I saw a lot of beautiful things, even though I was quote unquote still consciously within reality. I seemed to get a lot of clarity, even though it didn't really make 100% sense. But then
It
the
kind it kind of
next,
it kind of does though, in a way.
yeah. Well,
Like
but
I get
this is why I make the point. It's very hard to articulate what you mean because each experience is obviously subjective and personal to the each individual. It's the same way we understand the principle that no one diet is uniform and works for every human being because we're all individually unique. One size doesn't fit all, so to speak. So when you're relaying your experience of psychedelics, no two accounts are ever going to be the same. It's just not possible. Um,
I get what
but
you're,
yeah,
when you say I get it now. Like
yeah.
I explained this to you before. I've got a like a fabric sofa, and I was looking at the sofa and the material, and I must have been looking at it like 3 inches away from my face. I'm just staring at it for about 15
Mm,
minutes, and I'm looking at the texture, and I'm just like, this is unbelievable. And I've like really like homed into it. And where the pattern, and it's like a plain grey sofa, but when you zoom in, and especially the
mm,
20/20 vision you get when you're on mushrooms, I'm looking at the pattern and it looked like it. I think what I believed at the time, it's like I zoomed out of the matrix and I've looked at everyone within their little cell and they're all producing energy, almost like a binary type energy. I can't even explain it.
yeah.
And it keeps the system going. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, that's how it works. And I had this like
Mm,
epiphany. But the problem is, and I had this when I went even further into my last experience. You gather information which is beyond language and data. No, it is data, but it's like beyond what I can share. So it's like someone's giving you a message which is so well rounded and understood at that point, and then when you come back down and you try and articulate it to someone else, you're sharing like 1% of what you know. Does that make sense? So in
yeah,
that
it does.
moment, you get it, but you then can't pass it on. So it's such a frustrating experience as well.
Mm, yeah. Well, my second and ex uh, third and fourth sort of experiences after that have been more deeper ones, where I sort of delved into the realm of what Terence McKenna suggests if you really want to quote unquote go there, which what I mean by that is to a point where you have no choice. Like when you have a certain dosage, you're gonna you're gonna go somewhere. You're gonna go on a journey in the mind and lose touch with quote unquote reality. My second experience where I did 5 grams, like the difference between the experience that we've just talked about and described and this kind of experience where you hit the 5 gram sort of marker. I can't even begin to put it into words, the level of difference for me personally. um, Going back to the point we made earlier about losing all concept of time, I went so deep in that first time when I did 5 grams that when I thought I was back in the room, so to speak, one of the first thoughts I had was, how long have I been gone? Where is everybody? Where am I? What am I doing? Is this real? Am I alive? Did I die? And this was all because I had my eyes closed. And then I remember having the thought, I need to open my eyes just to make sure I'm still alive. And then when I opened my eyes, I thought I was back in, as we say, reality, but I was still under a deep, intense trip experience, and it still went on for hours. Only now it had taken on a new level and paradigm because I now had my eyes open, and that was just crazy. I mean, I've since done other trips of a similar dosage, and no two trips are the same. Like, and I've been through a range of experience, thoughts, and emotions. I've cried tears of joy, tears of sadness, had laughing fits, had moments of extreme clarity and peace, fear, like you say, when you start to think of concepts of like death and ego death, for a specific example.
Oh, the death loop.
Oh, you can just go on all kinds of tangents, but fundamentally, I would throw my hat on saying they are so beneficial to your understanding of self and your ability to progress with your own sort of self-image that I would recommend them to anybody. But I would like to stress that you should always carefully do your research and be very careful, because there are, potential dangers with having too much, maybe having a bad trip. I mean, can you imagine if you had a large dose, you were outside unattended, unaided with any like supervision of somebody that loves or likes and respects you, and you were just out there like just tripping balls, it would be
Oh, I'd lose my mind.
like, yeah, I couldn't even imagine what would go down if you just
People
took an
say
absolute
they're like, do it outside. Do it outside. No
oh
way. No
no, mate.
way.
I see.
Imagine that
I'm of the
when you
opinion I
realise
can't
you're
wait
like,
to do that. I can't wait.
imagine when you realise I'm tripping balls. How am I going to get home? And then maybe the police come up to you, or so like, oh, there's no way, because there's no coming out of it.
Well, this is why I heavily condone the concept of having someone, I call it a shroom sitter instead of a babysitter, because it pays and makes logical sense to have somebody who's compass mentis around you that cares for you, who's gonna look after you. If you go down the route of looking into um, ayahuasca and ibogaine and the toad and the indigenous sort of teachings and ceremonies behind taking such substances, what you'll notice is a recurring theme of there's always a shaman or a medicine man or just a guide to take care for you, because some psychedelic, especially the plant-based experiences, they can actually make you quite violently sick in part of the process. So it is always, I would recommend, a good idea to have somebody who's just looking out for your best interests. But that's not to say that, even as you said earlier, bad trips are bad trips. They're all good. It just depends on your perspective afterwards of how you pull it apart for personal and progressive sort of development and understanding.
Like I could have done with someone just saying, it's all right, it will end. Just get back in and enjoy it while it lasts. Just
Yeah,
something small like that gets you, that gets you kind of back on track.
yeah,
And after the experience, I honestly thought I could end up with schizophrenia here, because I can't tell the difference between reality and what I just experienced.
yeah,
And it took, like I said, it took me a while. So I think if you do it, and also where I've done the fun mushrooms, like I did it in Bali and we watched the sunset and that was fun. I've done a couple here where it's been fun, and I've been fully aware, like your first experience. The problem I did with the measurements is I did what they call penis envy, and it's 3 times stronger than your normal dose. So if you do a gram, you're talking 3 grams. You know, it's heavy.
Yeah.
It's really heavy. And so when I did the fun doses, when it becomes dark, it's fine. But this one, because it become dark as I was on my real come down, it was a dark experience. It was like I'm Bane in Batman, and I'm back in a bloody darkness. Like, it was a real horrible experience. So I think this is why a lot of people do it in daytime. And then obviously, and I would recommend this if you were to do it. And then once you come down, you have a few hours of daylight to really get your shit together. And then you can kind of get back to a normal way of thinking. Because mine was so light, it was so dark and it was becoming late, I just couldn't get grasp on reality. And I think that was the thing that I struggled with the most. But I think if you had a sitter, you would be able to bounce ideas off them and talk, and they'd be able to say, look, trust me, you know. And when you've got a loving, familiar face that could say that to you, again, you're in your subconscious. I think you trust it. Whereas when you're on your own, or you're freaking out, or you're with other people that are doing it as well, and they're laughing at you while you're trying to figure out what's going on, it becomes pretty distressing pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, that actually reminds me of the terrible sort of first experience that I referenced when I was in Amsterdam as a youngster. I mean, you yourself have been to Amsterdam, and I'm sure many of the listeners will relate to this. That is not the place to be, especially without a sitter, as we're talking about here. Like, mate, you know what Amsterdam's like. It is one of the craziest cities.
Yeah, it's quite a dark place in general, and I think, again, because you're in the subconscious, I think you'd pick up on that energy. And it sounds a bit weird, but like, this is what I find when I speak to people that don't really believe in this. Well, I don't believe in all that energy stuff, and it's like, consciously you don't, but subconsciously you do, because that's the way that it works. Whether you believe it or you don't believe it, that's the way it works. And when you're in that state, you're picking up conversations that are happening 100 yards away.
Yeah.
You're picking up the energy in the room next to you, you know. And that's what I was saying, actually, back to the point of the subconscious mind. They say, like, if you read a page in a book, it could take you 5 minutes or a minute or however fast you read, but your subconscious mind's read every single word in a second. It picks up everything and it throws it back into you like a funnel. So that environment is absolutely key. The first experience I had, again, I was in the Gili Islands. I was in Gili Air, which is just off Bali and just off the coast of Lombok. And it's the most beautiful place, tropical, jungle. It's just perfect. White beaches, turtles on the beach, you know, all of this stuff. And we sat there on a beanbag looking at the sunset, and I didn't move for about 2.5 hours. And at one point, I was looking at my foot, and my foot was dancing, and I was laughing. I was like, look at him. I actually called him him. I was like, look at him. He's having the best time of his life. And it's like this real fun experience. So that setting was like, it just doesn't get better than that for me anyway. Yeah. When you're in the UK and it gets dark early and it's cold and it's raining, that can play tricks on you, man. So I can imagine Amsterdam would do.
Oh yeah. Well, soon as you went back to the topic of the subconscious mind, I actually, a few years back, when I was involved in a network marketing company opportunity, which kind of sparked my thirst for personal development, I very quickly progressed into the teachings which a lot of people relate to as the law of attraction. So which is covered in a book famously by a lady called Rhonda Byrne, entitled The Secret. But when you start unpacking that and going deep onto those the concepts of the conscious and the subconscious mind, you'll find the man that was very influential and behind a lot of the theory on the law of attraction and the secret is Bob Proctor.
Yeah.
And back in the day, he did a program called You Were Born Rich. Incidentally, the whole program is actually on YouTube, so you can go watch it. It's pretty old.
Oh,
Well, I
just let me butt in. Sorry, let me butt in really quickly on that point, because I've had this conversation so many times. The person that actually taught her the law of attraction was Brian Tracy. She
yeah
went to a Brian Tracy seminar, and that's where she started studying it.
yeah
Where in Proctor thing, obviously Bob Proctor's on the video, and he's absolutely massive in that whole
yeah.
concept. But I
Well,
have to
Bob,
throw that in when people talk about this, because Brian Tracy, not a lot of people talk about Brian Tracy, but he is the man for that.
right, yeah.
Sorry to jump in there.
No, it's cool. I'm glad that you pointed it out because there is often a misconception that Rhonda Byrne and The Secret is attributed to Bob Proctor when, in fact, yeah, it is Brian Tracy. But Bob Proctor, his mentor was Earl Nightingale, and you sort of follow the sequence of and chain of connections. You'll find that they heavily teach from the teachings and concepts of Napoleon Hill, who wrote the infamous books Think and Grow Rich and Outwitting the Devil, two
Yeah.
amazing books that I would recommend to anybody. But the reason I bring Bob Proctor and his You Were Born Rich program up is because I actually studied that with my good friend Phil a number of years ago. And if people want a very technical but very comprehensive, in-depth understanding of the conscious and the subconscious mind, I would encourage people to look up the You Were Born Rich program, put together by Bob Proctor. His accomplice, or I say number two assistant, if you want to label it that, at the time that you'll see on the footage, if people look on YouTube at the full 10-hour seminar, there's a Canadian man by the name of John Canary who assisted Bob Proctor in delivering that seminar. I had the pleasure of meeting him a few times when we sort of came across the Born Rich program and were studying it ourselves. It just seemed to coincide, as fate would have it, that when we were made aware of John Canary, we soon noticed that he was in the UK giving a live seminar at a conference room in central London. And Phil, his partner Holly, and myself were like, we've got to go and meet him, like, because we just recently finished the You Were Born Rich program. And we just put some serious money down, front row seats, and we went down there. And Phil and Holly more intensely, in terms of mentorship, more so than myself. But we got to work with John for a good period of time, and he actually flew over to the UK several times after the seminar that we attended. And another person I would encourage people to look up, John Canary, and that's spelt with a K. He is a wonderful human being. And yeah, I would encourage anybody that's interested in the teachings of the subconscious mind to go and check out Bob Proctor and John Canary, because it's a really good point of education to get into the thick of these concepts of the subconscious mind and the conscious mind.
Yeah, I'm googling him as we speak. Actually, I've never heard of this guy.
Yeah, it's an amazing guy. It's just a real positive influence on my journey and countless others. Like some of his testimonials of all the people that he's helped in his career, it's just unbelievable. And Bob Proctor too. We actually went to a conference for the network marketing company that we used to be affiliated to, back in the day. We went out to Las Vegas to their annual conference, and Bob Proctor was one of the keynote speakers there. And
Oh wow.
As youngsters, as we do, we went out and had a little bit of an interesting sort of looking around Las Vegas, as you do when you're there. And we had a few too many shandies the one night before, which caused us to be late in turning up to the opening sessions and keynote speeches at the conference the following day. So we were a little bit hungover and a little bit late turning up to the seminar, and it had already sort of commenced. And we were rushing around the halls of the hotel where it was hosted, trying to get to the conference room and take up our seats. And we just happened to pass Bob Proctor in the hallway as he was making his way to the other end of the venue to then give his keynote. And it was just crazy because we were like total fanboys. He walked past us and we were like, there's Bob Proctor, like jaws on the floor. And I rate Philip because Philip was like, Bob, like a proper fanboy, reached out and shook his hand. And like, you can call this crazy, I don't really care. But I looked at Phil and he looked at me, and Phil was like, I felt an energy from his handshake, you know. We just burst out laughing. But yeah, Bob Proctor and John Canary, amazing human beings.
Yeah, I think what we've established here on this podcast, and this is the best thing I think about having an open forum conversation and not necessarily having we had an agenda, but we didn't have a script, is it always leads back to the same thing. And I found this when you look into things like Buddhism or Hinduism or like more kind of esoteric views on Christianity or Hermetism and these factors and the psychedelic, it always links back to the self, and it always links back to the subconscious mind. Yeah. And in mainstream science or the mainstream narrative, we can deny this as much as we want, but it's always it always goes back to that. And I think on your point in terms of medicine and the healthcare system, unless we address that and we admit that and we start studying that properly, officially, so it's not alternative studies, it's or pseudoscience as they like to brand it as. Yeah. Unless we look at this face on, we're not going to change anything, in my opinion. And it's almost like we're at the line now where, and this is why people like Bruce Lipton have become so successful, I feel, when he's looking at like epigenetics and things like that, and the mind over matter and the power of consciousness and the subconscious. Unless we really look at that and accept that we don't know, we don't know anything in reality, because we're looking in the wrong direction, at least. Yeah. We're not going to really understand what's going on, and that is the key takeaway, in my opinion, is you have to understand the self. And when they say know thyself, it literally means know the I instead of the me, and it's understand that you are that connection. And like I said before, psychedelics, they throw you into that. You can't deny it and you can't escape it. That is what it is. That is the be all and the end all of it.
Yeah, totally agree with that, mate. Totally agree. Well, I just looked at the time. We've been
this is a big one.
Yeah, we've been rattling on just shy of 2 hours now. So I know I can't speak for you, but I've got quite a busy schedule this evening, so I'm going to dip out on this one. But this has been awesome, mate. I think we've covered some real good content here.
Yeah, and I think at the very least we've given a real a real example of what this podcast is all about. And these are the topics, but they always link back to the same thing, as I just suggested. And I think as we go forward, we've got so much to talk about, and that's even ignoring the fact that we're going to have guests on experts in whatever field whatever field of study. So I think we got a lot to go by, and I think if we didn't leave it here, which as you rightly said, we probably should. I think this could go on for about 4 days, and we could just keep
Yeah,
going and going and going. And the reason is because the depth is real.
yeah,
And what we want to do at the Holocene podcast is we want to delve into those factors, but try and maybe break them down into specific segments, and I guess let the listener look at them holistically and maybe see the connection between the whole, the
yeah,
holistic connection, I'd say.
yeah, absolutely, definitely that. And as you mentioned, the listeners, we'd like to encourage the listeners to interact with us on our different platforms and fire us over some questions, whether it's to our email address or our social media platforms. Actively engage with us. Let us know certain topics that you might want to discuss or hear about for future episodes, and we'll take it on board and try and cover as many different broad spectrum of topics as possible moving forward. We really do appreciate interaction with our audience. If you would like to follow us and interact with our content, you can find us on Twitter, and our handle is at Holocene the. YouTube, where you can be found if you type in the Holocene podcast. Our Instagram is the_Holocene_podcast, and our email is holocenepodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, definitely. Right, should we leave it here?
Yeah, let's call it a day. We'll be back with another topic and another episode real soon. So we'll catch you on the next one.
Cool. Thank you, Ben. Speak soon.
You too, mate. Yeah, peace.